The headlamp caught it at the far end of the tunnel, maybe 40 feet ahead, standing perfectly still in the dark. Same orange vest, same scuffed knee pads, same helmet with the cracked vent on the left side that I'd been meaning to replace since my second day. Coal dust on the shoulders, the same pattern, the same density, the way it settles when you've been down here long enough for the air to stop moving around you and start moving through you. It was me. I knew it was me the same way you know your own handwriting or your own reflection in a window at night. Not a conscious recognition. Something deeper. Something the body does before the brain catches up. I didn't move. I couldn't. The dry grit in my throat made me want to cough, and I held it because some part of me understood without being able to say why, that making a sound would be wrong, that it would change something, that whatever was happening at the far end of that tunnel was happening in a register that noise might disturb the way you disturb ice when you step on it before you know if it'll hold. The figure raised its hand, slowly, deliberately. Then it pressed 3 fingers against the tunnel wall and tapped. 1, 2, 3. Each tap sent a faint vibration through the coal face that I felt in my boots more than I heard with my ears. Then it turned and walked into solid rock without slowing down, without bending, without any hesitation whatsoever, like the wall was a door it had used 1,000 times. I looked down at the timer clipped to my vest. The numbers on the face read 2:17, 2 in the morning and 17 minutes past, and I'd seen those numbers before I ever came down here. They were stamped in red on the warning label next to Rule 4, which I'd read twice during orientation and hadn't fully understood. From somewhere deeper in the rock, from a place that had no geometry I could map, I heard my own voice. You stayed too long. That was 6 days into the job. I need to go back to how I got there. My name is Wyatt Coulter Briggs. I'm 31 years old. I spent 4 years doing underground infrastructure surveys in Kentucky before a staffing firm connected me with the Beckley Ridge Coal Complex in Raleigh County, West Virginia. Nightshift. Shaft 17. The posting described it as standard maintenance and monitoring work, and the pay was 30% above market rate, which I told myself was because of the hours. I know now that the premium had nothing to do with the hours. The drive into Raleigh County takes you through the kind of landscape that compresses itself the closer you get. Hills folding into each other, trees on ridgelines standing too close together in the gray before sunrise. The Beckley Ridge facility sits at the end of a gravel access road that doesn't appear on most maps, a cluster of prefab structures and lighting towers around a shaft entrance that goes straight down into the coal seam below. The surface smells like diesel exhaust and iron-cold water. On my first morning, I stood outside the main office and breathed in and thought, this smells like every mine I've ever worked. I thought that was reassuring. Curtis Lowell Granger was the mine foreman, and he was a compact man in his mid-50s with hands that looked like they'd been worked into their current shape over decades of use, the way tools get worn to fit a specific grip. He ran orientation for all new night shift workers in a windowless room off the main equipment bay. And what struck me most about the way he spoke was the absolute absence of affect. Not nervous energy, not caution, not the performative calm some supervisors adopt when they're trying not to alarm new people. Just a flat, unhurried evenness, the way a person speaks when they're telling you something they've said many times and believe completely. He covered the standard material first. Ventilation protocols, lamp checks, radio frequencies, the location of emergency supply caches at intervals down shaft 17. I took notes the way I always do, in a small wire-bound notebook writing in the compressed shorthand I'd developed over years of underground work. Then he stopped. He looked at the 3 of us sitting at the folding table and he said, "Now I'm going to tell you the operational rules specific to this facility. You'll follow them exactly." They're not suggestions, they're not liability language. They're the reason the people who worked here before you are still here. He said the last sentence without any emphasis. Just delivered it like a fact about weather. The rules came out in sequence, and I'm going to tell you each one the way he told us because the language matters. The phrasing matters. I've turned these sentences over in my mind so many times since that week that they've worn smooth like river stones. Never stay in any marked tunnel longer than 20 minutes. And if you hear a second set of footsteps matching yours, stop walking immediately. Do not follow any path that slopes downward twice in a row. At exactly 2 in the morning and 17 minutes past, you must stop moving and turn off your light for 1 full minute. If you see another worker where no shift should be, do not acknowledge them. Always return using the same path you entered. Do not improvise. If the tunnel walls feel warm, leave immediately without looking back. 7 rules, and I noticed sitting at that table with my pen still moving, that none of them addressed anything I would normally consider a safety hazard. No mention of gas concentrations, load-bearing assessments, ventilation failures. No mention of the physical properties of the mine itself. Every single rule was about behavior, and about timing and pattern and how a person moved through the space. I wrote that down. I underlined it. The other 2 new workers didn't ask questions. I looked at them and they were both writing steadily, heads down, and I thought maybe they'd been briefed before orientation. Maybe there was context I'd missed. I asked Curtis why the 20-minute limit was tied to marked tunnels specifically rather than any corridor. And he looked at me the way a surgeon might look at a patient who asks a procedural question. Accurate, informative, but not going into the whole picture. The marked tunnels, he said, are the ones the mine knows about. I wrote that down too. I didn't know what it meant. I thought it was a way of saying those were the surveyed corridors versus the rough-cut access passages. I understand now that he meant it literally. After orientation, I was loading my lamp kit in the equipment bay when Randall Pierce Holcomb found me. Randall was the shift supervisor, a long man in his late 40s with a weathered stillness about him that I mistook at first for simple fatigue. He had a way of standing near you without crowding you, like he was giving you room to react. He said, "You asked about the marked tunnels." I said I had. He was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone choosing words, the pause of someone deciding how much of a foundation to lay. "The rules aren't for safety," he said. "They're for staying separate." I asked him what we were staying separate from. He picked up his lamp kit and checked the charge indicator. "Figure it out slow," he said. "That's the better way." I didn't understand that either. Not then. My first descent into Shaft 17 was the next evening. Working alongside Leon Avery Bledsoe, the drill operator assigned to the lower access corridor. Leon was a blocky, deliberate man who spoke infrequently and moved through the tunnels with the efficiency of someone who has internalized the geometry of a space so completely that navigation no longer requires conscious thought. He wore 2 timers on his wrist. Not 1. 2. I asked him about it and he said, without slowing down, "1 for now, 1 for backup. You don't want to guess down here." The descent in the cage takes about 4 minutes. When it stops and the gate opens, the darkness beyond the shaft landing has a quality that's different from the dark in above-ground spaces. It isn't just absence of light. It has texture. The air is cool and dry in a way that isn't refreshing, and more like the air has been separated from the weather cycle so long it's lost something. The dry grit was immediate. I felt it on my lips before I finished adjusting my lamp angle. Each breath had an incompleteness to it, like the air was 95% of what you needed and no more. Leon moved fast and I stayed close. He was checking marks on the tunnel walls as we walked, chalk indicators left by the previous shift that told us which routes had been last used and when. And that was the first thing I noticed that I cataloged as wrong without yet having the language for it. There were chalk marks ahead of us. Not marks from a previous shift using the same corridor. Not marks in the same hand as the ones behind us. Different marks. A different color chalk. Almost orange in the headlamp beam, slightly waxy. Like someone had pressed hard. They appeared on the right-hand wall at intervals, and they were at head height rather than the standard waist height placement most operators use. They appeared ahead of us as we walked. Not waiting there. Appearing. I stopped to look at one. Leon grabbed my arm before I could touch the wall. "Don't engage with markings you didn't make," he said, and moved us forward before I could ask why. And I let him because he'd been here longer and his urgency felt specific rather than general. That's when the footsteps started. We were moving through a stretch of the lower access corridor that curved right, and my steps made a flat, compact sound on the coal floor, and Leon's made a heavier sound. And then there was a third sound, not an echo. Echoes follow. This was concurrent, matching my rhythm exactly. Left, right, the same weight and pace coming from somewhere I couldn't localize. Not behind us, not ahead. More like from inside the wall on my left. Leon stopped. He grabbed my arm so hard I felt the pressure through my jacket. The footsteps continued for 3 more steps after we stopped. Exact steps, not a trailing echo. 3 deliberate, separate footfalls. Then silence. The dust hung in the headlamp beam in front of us, perfectly still. The air in that section of the corridor didn't move at all, and the rumbling I'd heard since we descended, that low, irregular vibration that I'd been attributing to distant machinery, stopped. Completely, as though whatever produced it had paused to listen. I didn't know what it was pausing to listen for. Leon waited 30 seconds, counting under his breath. Then he started moving again, and I matched him, and he didn't speak until we were back at the shaft landing getting into the cage. He said, "That's why there are 2 timers." He didn't explain further. I didn't push. I wrote everything down in my notebook on the ride up and stared at the page for a while before I understood that what I'd written wasn't answering any of the questions I'd arrived with. It was adding to them. The following night, I made the mistake that changed the scope of everything. I was in a side corridor off the main access, inspecting a ventilation coupling that had been flagged by the previous shift. The work was finicky, the mounting bracket had sheared, and I was focused. And time does something underground that it doesn't do in above-ground spaces. It loses its forward pressure, it flattens, and you stop feeling the minutes accumulate the way you feel them in daylight. When I finally looked at my timer, the display read the same minute it had read when I'd started. I assumed the battery had died. I tapped it, shook it. The display didn't change. I looked at the tunnel. It was longer. That's the only way to describe it. I knew the dimensions of this corridor from the facility map. I'd walked its length twice, and it was a standard cut, maybe 70 feet end to end. And what I was looking at was not 70 feet. The far end of the tunnel was farther than it should have been. Not dramatically farther, nothing cinematic. Maybe 120 feet. Maybe 140. The walls were the same width, the same coal gray color, the same chalk-marked intervals on the left side. But the end of the space had moved back. I told myself it was a visual illusion from the headlamp angle. I turned off my lamp. Turned it back on. The tunnel was still longer, and then I saw the figure at the far end. It was standing still, facing me. My vest, my helmet, my posture, the slight forward lean I carry in my left shoulder from an old survey injury. And the distance between us was, I estimated, about 50 feet, and the figure was doing what I was doing, which was standing completely still and looking back at itself. Then it started walking toward me. The stride was mine. The pace was mine. There was something about the specificity of it that was worse than if the figure had moved strangely or wrong. It moved exactly right. It moved the way I move when I'm not thinking about moving, when I'm just walking because I need to be somewhere else. I turned around and I walked back toward the main corridor, and I did not run because running felt like the kind of behavioral pattern that would mean something down there. And I had already started to understand without being able to articulate it fully that patterns were the thing to be careful about. I didn't look back. I could feel the stride behind me anyway. My own stride, following at the same distance. Randall was waiting at the corridor junction. He looked at me and asked how long I'd been in the side tunnel. I told him I didn't know. My timer had stopped. "Get above," he said, "now. Tonight's done for you." I asked him what the tunnel was doing. He handed me a dry rag to wipe the cold dust off my face. A gesture so ordinary against everything else that it took me a moment to process. You've been in there long enough for it to start mapping you," he said. "You don't want to give it enough data to finish." I wanted to ask him what it meant to finish. He was already walking and I followed, and I didn't ask, and now I wish I had pushed harder in that moment, because what he would have told me would have changed how I navigated the next 2 nights. I know that now. I knew it very soon after. The 4th night I came down and Randall pulled me aside before descent, and his voice was low in the way voices get when someone is deciding how much infrastructure to give the conversation. He said, "Do you understand why the 20-minute rule works?" I said I'd started to have an idea. He said, "It works because that's the threshold. That's how long it takes for the corridor to start building a model of your movement, in your weight distribution, your walking rhythm, your breathing pattern. 20 minutes is enough to template you. 21 minutes and it's already started. 30 minutes and you've contributed enough that you're part of the structure." The rumbling came from somewhere below us, slow and irregular, and I felt it in my jaw more than my ears. "Part of the structure," I said. "There are names on the walls down in the lower passages," Randall said, "written in coal. Nobody put them there with tools." I'd read about geological processes that create unusual markings in rock faces. I had 4 years of underground fieldwork. I know what natural formations look like. "How long has this been happening?" I said. Randall looked at me with the specific expression of a person who knows an answer that isn't going to be useful. "Since the first shift cut through shaft 17, he said. 32 years. And then he went down into the mine because there was work to do, and the mine had its own schedule regardless of what we understood about it, and I followed him. And what I felt walking into the cage that 4th night was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like the moment before you understand the size of what you're looking at. The 5th night, Denise Harper Voss, the safety officer, gave the pre-shift briefing. She was a precise woman, organized in a way that read as habitual rather than performed, and she walked through the operational checklist the same way Curtis Granger had walked through the rules on day 1. Flat, informative. Without the kind of emphasis that suggests the speaker is aware of subtext. She mentioned, almost in passing, that 3 workers from the previous week's rotation had not completed their shifts. She called them absent, not missing, and moved on to lamp battery protocols. I asked her about them after the briefing. 3 names. She gave me a look that was neither evasive nor alarmed. She said, "They were last seen in shaft 17 lower access, and they hadn't been following timing protocols." "Where are they now?" I said. "That's still being assessed," she said, and closed her clipboard cover and went to check the emergency beacon on the south wall. I thought about the names Randall had told me about, scratched into the walls where no tools could have reached. And I thought about what it meant to be part of the structure. And I went down because I was still at the stage where the work and the money and the professional reflex to simply continue functioned as a kind of ballast against the other thing I was beginning to understand. The fifth night was when the routes started changing. Not dramatically. Not in the way you'd recognize immediately unless you'd been tracking them with the precision I'd been applying since that second night. I had the facility map on a laminated card in my vest pocket, and I'd been annotating it in pencil. Small marks noting corridor states, landmarks, the locations of the chalk markings that I now understood were not made by the previous shift. On the fifth night, 2 routes I'd used on nights 3 and 4 didn't exist in their previous configurations, and the first was a connecting passage between the main access and the north ventilation corridor. It had been there on night 3. On night 5, the wall was continuous coal face, no passage, no shadow suggesting a passage had been there. I pressed my hand against the surface. It was cold, solid. The second was more subtle. A slight jog in the main corridor, a left angle that I'd memorized, was now a straight continuation. The angle had been removed. The geometry had been smoothed out. I'd seen mining walls shift before, usually from settling or equipment vibration. I know what that looks like. This wasn't that. Settling produces cracks, debris, displacement. This was the opposite. This was integration. The walls were smoother than they'd been before. That was when the full weight of Randall's word landed on me. Not collapsing, reorganizing. The mine was incorporating the roots into itself, smoothing the human-made edges into its own geometry. And the roots it was absorbing were the ones that had been used consistently, the ones that had been walked often enough to develop a pattern that the drift layer, whatever the drift layer was, could model and take in. I stood in the straightened corridor with the dry grit working into my throat and the headlamp showing me a tunnel that should have had an angle and didn't. And I thought about the rules with an understanding I hadn't had before. The 20-minute limit. The prohibition on the downward slope twice in succession. The requirement to return via the same path used to enter. Always the same path. Because if you went in via Route A and came back via Route B, you'd walk 2 separate paths. Given the mine 2 separate patterns contributed your signature to 2 corridors instead of 1. The rules weren't limiting our movement. They were limiting our legibility to whatever was down there reading us. The rule about 2 sets of footsteps. Stop immediately if you hear your own pace echoed back. Because the echo isn't an echo. It's the space beginning to model your gait. If you keep walking while it's modeling, you're feeding it more data. Rule 4. 2:17 in the morning. Stop moving, lights out 1 full minute, because in the dark, standing still, you're invisible. No movement to track, no thermal signature following a path. You disappear from the geometry and it can't find you and finish what it started. I didn't understand Rule 7 yet, the warm walls. That one would come, on the 6th night. And I was deep in the lower access when the radio crackled and Randall's voice came through with a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Not panic. Randall Pierce Holcomb was not a man who panicked, but there was a compression in his voice, a thinning, the sound of someone expending careful control. Wyatt, what's your position? I told him. East corridor, lower access, south junction. Silence for 4 seconds, then, how long have you been in the east corridor? I checked my timer. 18 minutes. Get out, he said. You've got 2 minutes. I started moving. The east corridor to the shaft landing was approximately a 4-minute walk at normal pace. I had 2 minutes. I moved faster than normal, which is exactly what I knew I shouldn't do. Because faster is a different pattern and a distinct pattern. And I was already 18 minutes into this tunnel and I could feel the difference. A pressure in the air that wasn't mechanical. A slight drag on each footstep like the floor was reading my weight distribution in fine resolution. The radio crackled again. Randall's voice. Are you still where you started? I said I was heading for the landing. He said, that's not what I asked. I stopped. The tunnel ahead of me was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Wrong the way a familiar room is wrong when a single piece of furniture has been moved 2 feet and you can't immediately identify what's different, just that something isn't sitting where it should be. The ceiling height was the same. The width was the same. The chalk marks were in the right positions, but the tunnel felt longer than it had been, in the same illusion I'd experienced 3 nights before in the side corridor. The far end receding by 20 or 30 feet when I wasn't watching it directly. I checked my timer. 19 minutes, 50 seconds. The rumbling from below had grown. It was different tonight. Not the low, irregular throb I'd been hearing since the first descent. Steadier, more patient. Like something that had been waiting and now had a reason to pay attention. 20 minutes came and went. I kept moving. I had no choice. Standing still at 20 minutes was worse than walking because at least if I was moving, I was generating a different pattern with each step. Varying my pace, varying my direction slightly, giving the drift layer something inconsistent to try to incorporate. At least I thought that was better. At the time, I thought that, and the routes I'd memorized had changed. The left angle connector I'd marked on night 3, the one that had been absorbed into a straight wall on night 5, I passed its location again, and this time there was a passage there. Not my passage. Not the one I remembered, a different shape, slightly lower, curving when it should be straight, a new passage, offered to me. I didn't take it. Rule 6, always return using the same path. I kept going forward and the corridor kept extending itself, and the dry grit in my throat was so thick by now that each breath tasted like the inside of a stone, and the headlamp threw shadows in configurations that didn't match the physical geometry around me. Long shadows cast at wrong angles, bent around corners that weren't there. Then the time hit, 2:17. I stopped. I turned off my headlamp, and the darkness was not empty. In the first seconds, I registered only absence. No light, no visual reference, nothing but the texture of the air on my face, the faint pressure of my own breathing against the walls. Then the sounds came. Not immediately, not all at once. Gradually, like a room filling with water. Movement on my left, soft and deliberate. A repositioning. Something shifting its weight from one side to the other the way a patient animal shifts when it's been holding still. Movement above, a slow sound like rock surface adjusting under a load. Movement ahead of me that I cannot describe better than this. It sounded like a corridor deciding something, and then a hand, brushing the outside of my right shoulder. Distinct pressure through the jacket. Definite. Present. Then gone. I stopped breathing for something close to 30 seconds. My own breathing came back to me from somewhere ahead. Not an echo, not the acoustic reflection of the tunnel shape. My breathing, my cadence, slightly out of phase with my actual lungs, like a recording being played back from memory. The minute passed. I turned on my headlamp. The tunnel was different, not catastrophically different, not a new mine. But the east corridor, which ran straight toward the shaft landing, now curved. The chalk marks were the same. The ceiling height was the same. The coal face on both walls had the same texture, but the tunnel curved right when it should have continued straight, and I could not see the shaft landing. And what was in front of me was a passage that had not been there 60 seconds before. I did not walk forward into it. I turned around, and behind me the tunnel also curved, but in the opposite direction, and I could not see where I'd come from either. I was in a section of corridor that had been repositioned around me while I stood in the dark. And then I saw him. 20 feet ahead, in the direction the new curve ran, standing in the outside edge of my headlamp beam. Wearing my vest, my helmet, my boots with the left lace tied double the way I do it. Standing with both hands at his sides and looking at the floor, not at me. Not yet. He was older. Not dramatically older. Maybe 5 years. Maybe 7. The skin at the corners of his eyes was different, and his posture had a weight to it that mine didn't have yet, a settled heaviness that comes from having carried something for a long time. He raised his head slowly. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my chest. I had the timer on my vest, and I saw his jaw move. He was mouthing something. I watched his lips. It took me 3 repetitions before I understood the words. "Don't finish the route." Then he turned and walked away deeper into the repositioned corridor, and I noticed something that I've turned over in my mind every day since. He walked like he knew exactly where he was going. Not lost, not afraid, not confused by the geometry. He moved through the reshaped tunnel the way Leon moved through the familiar corridors, with the unconscious ease of a person who has internalized the space completely. He'd been down here long enough to learn the new geometry. He'd been down here long enough for the mind to finish mapping him, and for him to learn the map in return. He walked to a section of the wall where the tunnel branched. One branch continued straight, one branch sloped downward. He paused at the junction for a long moment. I watched him place his hand against the left wall. The wall at the entrance to the downward branch, and the cold surface shifted slightly inward where he touched it. A subtle give, a recognition. Then he walked down the slope. The tunnel closed behind him, not with debris or collapse. It simply ceased to have an opening. The wall was continuous coal face, smooth as the absorbed corridors I'd been finding for 3 days. And the figure was gone. And what I was left with was the specific, contained weight of understanding something I could no longer unknow. He'd chosen it. The older version of me had chosen the downward slope, had walked into the mind's geometry deliberately, had touched the wall and been recognized, and had let it take him. Not as a victim, as something that had been remade into a compatible element. I understand now what the rules are built to prevent. The mine, what Curtis Granger had called the marked tunnels in his flat-voiced orientation. What I'd been calling the drift layer in my own notes is not a feature of the mine. It is older than the mine. The mine was cut into it. Shaft 17's lower access hit the drift layer somewhere in the early stages of excavation, and everything below a certain depth has been inside it ever since. It is a spatial system that incorporates movement, that templates bodies, patterns, rhythms, that uses the repeated movements of workers to extend and refine its own geometry, its tunnels growing more complex and more specific with every shift that passes through it. And when you walk a route for the first time, you're unknown to it. When you walk it twice, you've introduced a pattern. When you walk it enough times with enough consistency, you've given the system a complete model of your movement. You've become a predictable element. And the system integrates predictable elements. Not violently, not suddenly. It absorbs them the way water absorbs a dye, gradually, completely, until there's no clear boundary between the thing that was put in and the medium that received it. The rules are behavioral disruptions. Each one breaks a pattern before the system can complete its model. The 20-minute limit prevents sustained mapping. The footstep rule prevents the system from testing its model against your actual gait in real time. And the downward slope rule prevents access to the deeper sections of the drift layer where the geometry is oldest and most developed. Rule 4, the lights out minute, breaks the movement pattern at the precise moment in every shift cycle when the system is most active, most engaged. 217. I don't know why 217 specifically. I think there's a geological reason, a tidal rhythm, something in the deep pressure cycles of the earth in this specific part of Raleigh County. I think someone figured it out a long time ago by watching what happened when workers didn't stop. The rule about acknowledging other workers. Don't acknowledge them, because acknowledging them closes the social circuit. It confirms the double is real. It validates the model. A model that gets validated by the person it was copied from becomes more stable, more defined, more capable of completing the integration it was built to perform. And Rule 6, return via the same path. This one I had backwards for days. I thought it was about consistency, about not introducing new corridors to the system. It's not. It's about coherence. If you go in via Route A and come back via Route B, you've walked through the system as two separate elements. You've fragmented your signature. The system builds two incomplete models, and incomplete models don't integrate cleanly. They persist. They become echoes that the system keeps referencing. The workers who violated Rule 6 didn't disappear into the mine. They became the extra footsteps. They became the figures at the ends of corridors. They became the breathing in the dark. The mine keeps their models running because it never completed them. In the names on the walls, written in coal where no tools could have reached. Those are the workers the system finished integrating. Those aren't graves, they're something else. They're acknowledgments. The mine logging what it absorbed. Denise Voss's missing workers. 3 of them. I know what she'd find if she looked at the walls in the deepest sections of the lower access. I know whose names would be there, pressed into the coal in no handwriting that any tool produces. How long this has been happening, I can only partially answer. Randall said 32 years since the first shift cut through. But the drift layer is geological. It's been down there absorbing and integrating for longer than humans have been digging into this hillside. What we found when we cut through it wasn't something we created. We cut a hole in something that was already running, already active, already doing exactly what it does. We just started sending people through it on a schedule. I don't know how many workers went into Shaft 17 in those early years before anyone understood the rules. Before someone watched carefully enough and survived long enough and compared enough notes to figure out what the thresholds were. I don't know who that person was. I've thought about whether it might have been Curtis Granger. The flatness in his voice when he read the rules, the specific quality of a person who has moved past fear and arrived somewhere else entirely. I got back to the shaft landing at 4:47 in the morning. I don't know exactly how I navigated the repositioned tunnels. I kept breaking pattern. I changed my pace every 30 seconds. I stopped and reversed twice, deliberately, because I could feel the floor reading my weight, and I wanted to give it data it couldn't complete. I avoided the new passages the system opened ahead of me. I found the original East Corridor through a junction I recognized from a chalk mark I'd made myself, my own notation in blue pencil at waist height, and I followed the original geometry back. Randall was at the landing. He looked at me without asking questions, the way someone looks at a person when they already know the relevant answers. He said, "You saw it." I said I'd seen the figure, the older version. He said, "Most people don't come back after they see it, not because they can't, because they choose not to." I asked him what the figure was specifically. I wanted his name for it. He said, "It's what you'd become if you let the mind finish what it's trying to do. It's your movement pattern learning to navigate the space on its own without you, without the body. The system generates it when integration is close to complete." He paused. "When you see it, you're past the point where the mind just knows you. You're at the point where it's offering you the integration voluntarily." The hand on my shoulder in the dark. The warmth that hadn't been there before. I'd felt the walls in that repositioned section, and they'd been warm. Rule 7. I hadn't recognized the warning when I was receiving it. I came up in the cage as the eastern sky was going pale gray above the tree line. The other workers at the surface ignored my return or appeared to, and in the specific way of people who have calibrated what they look at and what they let pass without comment. I filed my paperwork with Denise Voss and walked to my vehicle and sat in the driver's seat for a long time. The drive out of Beckley Ridge takes about 20 minutes on the gravel access road, and then you're on the state route heading north. I know that road. I'd driven it 6 mornings in a row. I know where the curve is before the county line, where the water tower sits above the ridge on the left. where the gas station with the missing letter on its sign sits at the junction. The distances were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not impossible to rationalize. The curve came sooner than I remembered. The water tower sat on the right instead of the left, and the gap between the gas station and the junction was longer than it had been every other morning. I told myself I was tired. I told myself 6 nights of underground shift work on minimal sleep distorts spatial memory. I've read the studies on that. I know it happens. I reached for my phone to check the time. The lock screen glowed. 2:17, it read. And then the display corrected itself, jumping forward to 6:22 in a single frame, like a gap in film where one frame was spliced out. I sat in my idling vehicle on the shoulder of the state route and breathed the outside air, which should have smelled like creek water and pine sap and the diesel from the passing transport truck. And it did smell like those things. It also smelled like coal dust, like the dry, deep mineral smell of a place that doesn't get weather, a place that doesn't get light. I've driven home from work every morning since that week. I've gone back, because Randall was right. You don't get to stop going back once the mine has started working on you. Not because it forces you, because leaving would mean never knowing. And not knowing, I've discovered, is its own version of being lost in the dark. Every morning I check the landmarks. I note the positions, I track the distances against what I measured the day before. I keep a notebook in the glove compartment and I annotate it the same way I annotated the facility map underground, in pencil, small marks, careful notation. Most mornings the distances are correct. Most mornings the water tower is on the left and the curve comes when I expect it and the familiar geometry of the surface world holds. But some mornings I check the notebook and there's a discrepancy I can't explain. A gap of 20 feet where there was no gap before. A right angle that's become an obtuse angle. A road that continues straight when my notes say it used to curve. The drift layer incorporates predictable movement. I drive the same route every morning, at the same speed, at roughly the same time. I've thought a great deal about whether I left the mine behind or whether it left something behind in me. I've thought about whether there's a meaningful distinction between those two things. I don't have an answer. I don't think the answer is the kind of thing you arrive at cleanly, by reasoning, the way you arrive at a figure in a calculation. I think it's the kind of thing you discover incrementally, and by measuring the world around you very carefully for a very long time, and paying close attention to the days when the numbers don't match. This morning the water tower was on the left, and the curve came exactly where it was supposed to, and the gas station sat at its junction with its missing letter, and the distances were all within a half a mile of what they were yesterday. Most mornings that's true. I keep the notebook in the glove compartment. I check it every time.